This is apropos. US officials say the Pentagon has ordered about 1,500 active duty soldiers in Alaska to prepare for possible deployment to Minnesota amid increasingly tense confrontations between residents and federal officers since the shooting dead of Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother of three, by an ICE officer earlier this month. The Army units have been placed on prepare to deploy orders in case violence escalates in the Midwestern state. Karis Garland has the latest.
A church service descended into chaos on Sunday as protests against an immigration crackdown in the U.S. state of Minnesota continue. Demonstrators stormed into the church in St. Paul, shouting the name of Renee Nicole Good, who was fatally shot by an Immigrations and Customs Enforcement officer earlier this month. They allege that one of the church's pastors, David Easterwood, also leads the local ICE field office, overseeing the operations that have involved violent tactics and illegal arrests. The U.S. Department of Justice has launched an investigation into the protesters. On social media, Attorney General Pam Bondi said attacks against law enforcement and the intimidation of Christians are being met with the full force of federal law. Since the killing of Renee Good, Minnesota has seen increasingly tense confrontations between residents and federal officers. The Pentagon has reportedly ordered about 1,500 active duty soldiers in Alaska to prepare for a possible deployment to the state.
There's no excuse for them to be bringing in federal troops. They're talking about martial law. And, we have the right to protest and to have our voices heard.
Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey has said any military deployment would exacerbate tensions in Minnesota's largest city, where the Trump administration has already sent 3,000 immigration and U.S. Border Patrol officers to deal with protests. Meanwhile, the state's Democratic Governor Tim Walz, against whom the Justice Department has opened a criminal investigation, has mobilized Minnesota's National Guard. This is part of a bid to support local police and the, quote, rights of peaceful demonstrators.
For more, we're joined now by Ilan Wurman, a law professor at the University of Minnesota. Ilan, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. A tense showdown, as we saw in that report at that church over the weekend. You actually teach at the University of Minnesota. Describe, if you can, just how difficult the situation has been there on the streets in the state more generally since the death of Renee Good.
Sure. Well, it has been very tense throughout the community. Fortunately, at the University of Minnesota, where I am, the activity has been pretty muted. It's also very cold here, which I'm sure you are aware, which also mutes the activity a little bit. So it is tense throughout the city. Today, it's a bit more muted, but everybody is, of course, on edge.
And what do you think is going to happen next? Everybody there on edge. We keep hearing, threats from Trump. The latest is that perhaps there are going to be troops sent to Minnesota. Do you think that's actually going to happen?
I think it's unlikely that it would happen. I do think that President Trump would be on good authority to send troops or the militia under what is called the Insurrection Act. It is unfortunately named because it involves a lot more than just insurrection. The law actually applies any time that there is an unlawful combination or assemblage or obstruction that makes it impractical to enforce the laws through the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. There's even a broader statute that was enacted just after the Civil War that would give the president even broader authority. So textually, from the text of the statute, the president would have a lot of authority, but people understand that the text of the statute should be interpreted narrowly because we generally don't believe in using law enforcement using the military for civilian law enforcement purposes. So it should be a last resort, even though the president would be on good authority, would have the authority to do it. So I think he's showing some good sense and good judgment, reserving that as a last resort.
And who would ultimately decide whether or not all of this is unlawful or whether or not it's legal? Would it come down to the courts?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So, what is the role of the courts here when the president declares that the conditions are met, allowing him to bring in troops or the militia, which today is the National Guard? So, historically, the courts would have had to wait until somebody was injured. So, there's this interesting case out of the War of 1812 where America fought England again after the Revolutionary War. And James Madison, who was president at the time, called forth the militia. And the Supreme Court eventually addressed that mobilization of the militia, but it took years after the fact because the way it came is somebody declined the call to come serve in the militia. He was court-martialed in absentia. He was fined. He refused to pay the fine. The local marshal seized his horse in order to pay the fine. And then the individual who didn't show up to the militia ended up suing the marshal, who then defended on the ground that the militia call was constitutional. So that was 200 years ago. Today, courts take a more active role, but the president is going to get a lot of deference, right? If the president says, my federal law enforcement on the ground tell me that we need to deploy the militia, we need to deploy the armed forces because the ordinary course of judicial proceedings are insufficient, who's going to second guess that? What would give a judge more institutional competence, right? There are 600 judges throughout the country. There is one president whose duty it is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So what responsibility does a judge have to tell the president that the president's wrong about something within the president's institutional competence? So courts do have a role here when there are private injuries. And so we'll see how it plays out, but the president is likely going to get deference from the courts here, certainly from the Supreme Court of the United States.
And Ellen, he's already deployed the National Guard to several US states. Why is what is happening in Minnesota different in Donald Trump's view?
Well, this is also a fantastic question because the statute that they were using for the National Guard to deploy in Oregon and Illinois and California was actually a different statute written in the early 1900s that nobody really had heard about. It's a statute about federalizing the National Guard. Well, there's an earlier statute from 120 years before that called the Militia Act, which is today called the Insurrection Act, which seems to give the president actually even broader authority than the statute that he was relying on in the Oregon and Illinois and California cases. So the Supreme Court has recently pushed back against Trump's use of the National Guard in California, Oregon, and Illinois based on that other statute. But the Insurrection Act, or what I call the Militia Act, because it's much broader than just insurrection, is a different statute that gives the president much broader authority. And so are the facts on the ground that much different in Minnesota than they were elsewhere? I don't know, but he's using a different statute.
And as we heard in that report, the mayor of Minneapolis says that any kind of military deployment would only exacerbate tensions. You say things are kind of calm there today, but would you agree with that view?
Look, as a general matter, I think we don't want the military on the streets. That's of course, America fought the revolution in part because of the standing armies that there were, right? That was a small part of the grievance against England, but it was nevertheless an important part of the grievance. But we do have a role for for the military in law enforcement, especially when state and local authorities are at pains to support federal officers or interfere with federal law enforcement. So historically, federal troops have been used when state officials have actively interfered, actively thwarted. So, for example, when the states in Arkansas and elsewhere in the South tried to stop the desegregation court orders from the federal courts, Eisenhower famously sent in the 101st Airborne. We don't have that here, but we do have statements from our governor and our mayor that are pretty clearly saying that, we do not support federal law enforcement here, and there are people who are interfering with federal law enforcement on the streets, and the local officials are, of course, doing a little bit, but not as much as they could. And of course, we have to remember that a lot of this comes from the so-called sanctuary city policies, which, again, if we didn't have a sanctuary state and a sanctuary city policy here, then local officials would not release unlawfully present aliens who have committed crimes. They would instead detain them until the federal officials could come and enforce the law. Well, so long as that the state and local authorities are not going to assist and help federal law enforcement, you can see why the administration feels it has to send more federal officers to the city because the local and state officials are actively not cooperating. So there are many ways to reduce tensions. Yes, bringing in the army would increase tensions, but you know what also would reduce tensions? If the state and local authorities cooperated more with federal law enforcement, including with respect to enforcing the laws against people who are here illegally and who have committed crimes, which is what a lot of these detainers are, and the sanctuary city policies protect those individuals a lot. There's a lot more cooperation that can be had all around, but it's not just the federal government's fault. Local, state, and federal officials all need to sort of take a step back and figure out how we could all cooperate and act peacefully together.
Given all of that, though, is Donald Trump actually guilty of federal overreach here, as many are accusing him, particularly many Democrats?
I don't see how he would be guilty of federal overreach, because what is at issue here is executing federal law. Nobody doubts that the individuals, with some who are being detained and stopped and the laws being enforced against, are individuals who are here without a legal basis. A lot of them are individuals who have committed crimes, but who are then let out because of the sanctuary city policies. And so there's federal jurisdiction. Federal law is supreme over state and local law. Federal law applies in all 50 states. Federal law enforcement are allowed to go and execute the law in all 50 states. And, if the Trump administration has been overly aggressive with a show of force and deploying all of these law enforcement officials, it may be a political overreach, or maybe as a prudential matter, they should not have done that. But from a legal perspective, they're clearly within their rights to seek to have the federal laws enforced in a city and a state that they feel is not cooperating with them as much as they should. And so so again, as a prudential matter, are they trying to make a political statement by sending such a show of force, having such a show of force? Of course. As a legal matter, are they within their rights to do it? I think probably yes.
Ilan, thanks so much for taking us through all the legalities. That is Ilan Wurman, law professor at the University of Minnesota. Thanks so much for your time.